Hello there and welcome to Brussels, my love, your News' weekly chat show that takes a look at the good and bad of EU policy making. I'm Maeve McMahon. Thanks for tuning in. Coming up this week, all eyes on Germany. Thousands poured onto the streets of Berlin last weekend to protest against a new anti-immigration motion that was passed thanks to the support from the far-right Alternative for Deutschland. With elections coming up on the 23rd of February, the EU's biggest member state looks set to break the traditional firewall that has kept extremist parties out of decision-making. We take a look at this political pickle for the Conservative frontrunner Friedrich Merz and hear what else is at stake in these important elections. And not even 1 month in power, and US President Donald Trump is sending jitters around the continent. Grabbing headlines lately is Greenland, the picturesque Danish island of just over 50,000 people. Reacting to President Trump's calls to make it American, the French have said they will put up a fight. They're even willing to send in European troops to protect it. We take a look at the size of the threat and check how Brussels should respond. A warm welcome to our guests this weekend. Peter Heffele, Policy Director at the Wilfred Martin Centre, a think tank affiliated with the European People's Party. Raquel Garcia Armida van der Vella, Liberal MEP from the Netherlands. And Ian Lesser, that's the director of the Brussels branch of the American think tank, the German Marshall Fund. Lovely to see you all. Thank you for joining us. But before we bring in your views, let's just hear about the predicament facing the leader of the German Christian Democrats. That's the politician hoping to be the next Chancellor of Germany.
Friedrich Merz reportedly expected some public opposition, but not this. Hundreds of thousands of people took to the streets across Germany to protest against Merz. At least 160,000 in Berlin alone. Political observers are talking about a political gamble that backfired spectacularly. Merz had presented the Bundestag with proposals for tougher migration policies. This happened after a man from Afghanistan attacked a group of children with a knife, killing a 2-year-old boy and a man. Friedrich Merz's non-binding resolution got a majority with the help of the far-right AfD party, causing a monumental uproar in Germany's political establishment. Did Merz undermine the firewall that keeps the extreme right from power? Was he jumping on a populist train to win an election? Did he strengthen the AfD? The answers on February 23rd, when Germany goes to the polls.
So the answer's at the end of February, but in the meantime, of course, we can speculate. I mean, Friedrich Merz, he had promised, Peter, not to do business with the far right. Has he lost his credibility now by agreeing on this motion?
Well, I think, in my opinion, Friedrich Merz did the right decision. We have an impasse in German politics for too long on certain issues, so sooner or later you have to break through these issues. And he made proposals to the other parties. Apparently they didn't agree. I think the differences had not been as big. We unfortunately are in campaign mode. That doesn't help in many issues. But we cannot longer watch and don't act. That's what people now expect from us.
Because mainstream parties, though, have for a long time have had this so-called Brandmauer, the firewall around the AfD, meaning parties would not govern or go into coalition with the far right. And it also meant that mainstream parties wouldn't even introduce legislation that could only be passed with the far right support. What's your view, Raquel? Because, of course, your party is affiliated with the Liberals, the AfD, who do agree with Friedrich Merz on many of his policies. Since this U-turn, has he gone down in your estimations?
Well, we're not affiliated with the AfD in any possible way.
But the FDP?
The FDP. Yeah, they participated in this vote partly, and they supported part of the proposals. My own party, D66, and my fraction, Renew Europe, in the European Parliament, is very clear about this. We don't deal or do dealings with extreme right, especially not taking part in governments with extreme right parties. And I think the most important message to voters out there, and also seeing the reaction of the German people, is when we tried to take on extreme right narratives, the only ones who win are extreme right parties. It helps no one else.
And just, Ian Lesser, from a Brussels perspective, did Friedrich Merz, in your view, and he's a banker turned politician, by the way, did he jump on the populist bandwagon here? How's he been viewed here from Brussels?
Well, no, but look, I think it really asks two questions. I mean, one is about political tactics and whether this is something sound in the near term. Apparently not, or even in the long term, where it will be tested, and we will see. But there's also the question of the extent to which more centrist parties take on these issues that are really central to the right, to the hard right, and that is happening. Whether they actually go into formal parliamentary agreements, coalitions. It may in the end be more about the issues than it is about whether you deal with these parties or not. But I would agree. I mean, it is opening a very difficult issue that is likely to be repeated elsewhere.
And as we've seen it in other countries, indeed, it's already happening. Nonetheless, I can only repeat, there is an issue to be acted on. If you look into polls, migration matters dramatically, and we have to find answers from a centrist perspective. We can no longer leave these answers to one side of the spectrum.
Right. Yeah, sorry, but what happens is what we have seen in the Netherlands, where we have a four-party coalition with the extreme right, with very big plans and ambitious plans to curb migration. They're doing nothing. They don't get anything through, and the measures that they take are completely ineffective and purely a display of show politics. So I do think that we have to tell the honest story to voters. If you want solutions to migration, they will come through the middle and not through the extremes.
I fully agree, but they didn't act accordingly, whether there had been chances. So this is an obligation, a responsibility for the centrist parties, and that's what we have to aim after the elections.
Well, one lady who's very pleased with what Friedrich Merz has done is the head of the AfD, Alice Weidel. She's second place, by the way, in the polls, and she took to X to say the firewall has fallen. This is very good news for the country.
Well, I leave this to Mrs. Weidel. I think it has not fallen. But if you look a bit further, after the 24th of February, coalition building will be extremely difficult for the moment. There's only one option. That is a kind of grand coalition. Yeah. We revived. And I'm not very happy about that perspective, because this is part of this impasse and people want change and they probably won't get it. So I'm very concerned about that.
People want change. But just on that point, we wanted to hear from Liv Schraud, our correspondent in Berlin, to see what the political implications of this incident were and also what the atmosphere in the Berlin capital is like just a few weeks before the elections. Take a listen.
So the mood in Berlin is understandably very taut, with the snap election taking place in just 2 weeks. These elections are arguably Germany's most important since 1933, where the country will decide if it sways towards the right, like many other European countries, or if things stay largely the same. As we saw from the Insta poll this week, Merz's political gamble didn't seem to have affected voters too much, with support for CDU staying at 30%. However, both the Greens and Die Linke parties reported record numbers of new member applications following those demos that took place last weekend that attracted hundreds of thousands of people across the country.
That's Liv Schraud there, our correspondent in Berlin, with that update. So it seems Merz is stable for now, but of course the challenge will be for him to form a government, Ian, after these elections.
Well, absolutely. And, look, forgive me as an American sitting here in Brussels, this has become a transatlantic issue in a way. I mean, there are key personalities in the United States, as we know, weighing in on this election and supporting AfD. And, this is...
Elon Musk, you can mention
the
name.
You could mention the name. So there is partly about ideology. It's partly about, setting examples. It's partly about, simply key personalities are out there in the media and have a certain traction and can make things happen. And so a lot of this is going to be tested. We will see in the German result whether these tactics succeed or whether they don't. But it will be very meaningful.
And it's a very meaningful vote. I mean, absolutely. In here in Brussels, of course, everyone is glued to those elections. But just back to the voters, Peter, you're from Germany. You said immigration is one topic, economy, I'm sure, the other.
Absolutely. This rapid changes in our statutory structure is what Merz, of course, has also high credential because he has this business background. That's where we are measured against, definitely. And I hope more in European initiatives. This was something which I complained very much over the last years, that there have been no real initiatives from Berlin, and having the other partners, such France, in a weak position.
Well, indeed, Germany has been missing. Germany and France, the kind of Franco-German alliance has been very much missing in the last couple of years.
There's a bit of a power vacuum in Europe at this moment, and that is concerning. So I look with a lot of attention and concern to the developments in Germany, but also the developments in France. But I would like to circle back to the issue of providing voters and citizens with solutions, and especially when it comes to European solutions. Look at the Migration Pact. We need to implement that, but we already see that the measures that we have taken in recent years have led to the first decrease in illegal migration in years. We saw that in the numbers from last year. So the things that we are doing at European level with support from member states are already working. Yes, there are some fronts where we do need to improve. One of them is the return of people who did not have rights to asylum, for illegal migrants. And that's something we're working on. So I also want to give a message of calm, to say, yes, we have problems. We are addressing them at European level. And what does not help is to open the door to those who want to destroy those fundaments of European action.
And what are your solutions and Friedrich Meiss's solutions for this?
Well, these are nothing revolutionary. These are mostly things which are already in place, which has to be reinforced to a large extent. It's not so much about creating new laws. There are a lot of issues indeed. And there's a problem in federal states, of course, the coordination between different levels. But in terms of content, there's a large consensus among the centrist parties.
Yes, but I would honestly, I really fundamentally disagree with that, because denying an asylum application at the border is very likely against the rules, legislations and international agreements that we have made.
Ian, you want to weigh in there?
No, I was just going to say, you see this being tested in Italy, where, obviously Prime Minister Meloni has really, had made a key issue of this and trying to manage the migration problem, in essence, from Albania, and exporting the problem and exporting the control. It's being challenged in the courts, despite her political skill, and she has a lot of political skill, actually. Actually, she's an interesting example of how she can be very, very forward-leaning on an issue like this, which is really sort of red meat to the constituency. And on the other hand, on other issues can seem quite moderate.
And also, it's at the end of the day, it's about what Germans want, what voters want, what people want. And I've seen a number of newspapers in Germany and academic institutions. They've started this new campaign. Have you seen it? Called Zusammenland. Mm-hmm. Vielfalt macht uns stark. Diversity makes us strong. So over 500 companies, foundations, associations and NGOs, they're worried about the image of Germany. And of course, this plan that Germany could be working with right-wing extremists.
Well, my point is less the migration part, it's the integration part. And there's a lot of things to be done. This has totally underestimated. And yes, we need this diversity, this immigration, a more controlled one, more to the needs of our society and economy, definitely. But these are the issues we have to work upon. And this is an issue not just for the national level. This is very much on the local level, where at the end it makes a difference.
It's almost like the most unsolvable issue, no? We've been twirling around in circles on this issue, Raquel, for many, many years. And it feels like it's the hardest one to really find consensus on.
I think that we have consensus. I think that we have a very good asylum and migration pact reached after years of negotiations at EU level, which is starting to show the first positive results, and it has not even been fully or even partly implemented yet. But I do think that we also have to, again, going back to my point of telling the honest story, that some things will take time, and on some things we do have to accelerate a bit. Like I said, I agree that looking at the issues with migrants who need to be returned to the lands of origin is something that we all should be concerned about.
And just another issue regarding mainstream politicians, it's no secret that far-right parties are managing to seduce voters. They're getting more and more popular all across. How are mainstream parties addressing this? Like we saw this week, for example, the Socialists, they had a retreat here in Wallonia, scratching their heads really to try and find a way to become relevant again.
I think it's very, very tough. I mean, I would fully agree that, having a more objective, sort of policy and legally based approach to this issue would be great. But in fact, it's an extremely emotional issue for people. And I mean, there is some history to show that when centrist parties try to take on these issues that are very strong on the hard right, they don't do it as well, and they don't have the same political traction sometimes in doing it. So there's a certain risk, but parties are being driven in this direction. People are demanding it. There are others, employers and others may have different perspectives, but
and the
it's
EPP, of course,
huge.
the European People's Party, looking to use EU funding as well to build fences across Europe. Is this a policy you support?
Well, my biggest concern, frankly speaking, is not the rise of the right, it's the rise of the non-voters. We see a dramatic loss in trust in our system, and that is where we have to work upon. These are the largest
Especially
party
among young people.
in particular.
But interestingly, this week we saw Frans Timmermans in town, Dutch politician, of course, the creator or the architect, if you like, of the European Green Deal, the former commissioner in charge of climate. He was proposing something interesting, that the socialists and the Greens should join.
Yes, that's something that they have been experimenting with in the Netherlands for a couple of years now. Not entirely successful on some fronts. On some other fronts, it does show that cooperation can help. But I think that regardless of whether we have one party, three parties or four parties, what I already said, it's about also offering realistic solutions to the problems of people. And I also think that the progressive side of the political spectrum has to be also very clear in acknowledging what the problems are, but also not hesitating to say what other problems are created when we leave the spectrum to the extremes. And going back to the economy, European citizens are concerned about the economy. They are concerned about the future.
And they want solutions.
And they want solutions. But what do we get now? A possible trade wars inflicted by the shining light of the extreme right and their model child, which is Donald Trump. Do Europeans want that?
Maybe Ian Lesser can weigh in there. Of course, it's something you've been following very closely at the German Marshall Fund.
Yeah, well, look, we all have our views about it. My own personal view is it's very difficult to know what the end objective is here. I think, President Trump himself is a political personality. He's kind of his own thing. He's sui generis. And yes, there are certain ideological attachments to the right-wing agenda, but he's now, don't look to that first experience with him, I think. This administration is likely to be very different than the first, and much more ideological, much more effective in some ways. He's now got a cadre of people who take these issues like immigration and other things that are really lightning rods for the hard right, and they project them into his administration using executive orders and other things. Very different. And so, yes, I mean, I think it's an interesting question, the extent, not just interesting, it'll be a very consequential question, the extent to which European politics begins to reflect more and more of this, and vice versa.
And meanwhile, the face of the European Parliament has changed as well a lot since the elections last spring. A lot more extremists or more right-wing voices in there, which will make consensus building much more difficult.
Well, yet remains this kind of great coalition, if we include the ECR, the Italian in particular. There's still a consensus on many issues. I'm not as pessimistic. There's a stronghold in the middle, hold indeed, and we are very curious indeed, but you have much more experience.
You have more experience, Raquel. Tell us how it's changed in your view.
Well, we do see that the discourse gets extremer and harsher. I have been debating with colleagues from also partly ECR, the group of Meloni, and debating with colleagues from extreme right, where I have had to hear things like there is a conspiracy to replace the white population of Europe with migrants. I don't think that's acceptable. And I do think that the political middle, including the colleagues of the European People's Party, should stand up every time and say that's not language that we should be allowing in this chamber.
Which leads me to a point I wanted to mention in the German debate as well. It's the use of language, of course. We as politicians and media very much central to this. I think we should also go a bit further down there, the historical references to 1932 or something. I think this is totally nonsense, ridiculous. I think if you go to that extent, you hardly go back. And this is also destroying the public discourse space. That's what I'm very much concerned, that we are not longer able to talk to each other, destroying the very fundamental issues.
But Peter, maybe because I've heard again references to population replacement, which has roots in fascist Europe, in Nazi Germany. Do you feel that that's something that we should tolerate?
No, there are clear limits, definitely. But on the other hand, as you correctly pointed out, there are pragmatic solutions, and we have to take care about what language we are using. Otherwise, we divide the society, and there's no way to come together any longer.
And the message you send, of course, to people then is very, very negative. But meanwhile, as the Germans are getting ready to vote, the Belgians have just got a brand new government. No less than 234 days after the June elections, the so-called Arizona government has been endorsed. The five-party coalition makes up of the right-wing nationalists, N-VA, the Liberal Democrats, the centre-right, CDU, and the centrists and the socialists as well. And the new Prime Minister is Bart de Wever. He is the former mayor of Antwerp, known a couple of years ago for being the politician who wanted to split Belgium. Have you been following the news here in Belgium? Could we see kind of a Flanders first vibe in this government?
Yeah, well, look, I mean, what does it tell us? I mean, first of all, it's part of the shift to the right in Europe generally. I mean, this is a different kind of mix than you would normally, but it is a mix, and it's a very consequential mix, and it's very Belgian in that sense. I don't frankly see Belgium going in the direction. It's not going to split apart. You could see more of a weight for Flanders in various aspects, but that was already there. I mean, in fact, there were those who were argued that, Bart de Wever, as mayor of Antwerp, was in a more powerful position than as the Prime Minister of Belgium.
Yeah, because we alluded to all the parties that will have to govern with him. Of course, he'll be sitting with the ECR, so with Giorgia Meloni, the Conservatives and Reformists at the Council, so we'll see a little change there. But he's actually more aligned probably with your party on most of his principles.
Well, I'm very delighted. If I looked into the first announcements, they touch topics which are very important. The social reform, the social system in Belgium is for decades something to be overhauled.
You're delighted, but some in Brussels are not. We've seen a couple of protesters this week. The trade unionists are a little bit worried about that new government. But for more information on that, you can take a look at our website, euronews.com, because with that conclusion, we can bring this conversation to a close. Thank you so much to our panellists for being with us. And stay with us here on Euronews, because after a short break, we'll be heading to Greenland to see why it's pretty much all over our headlines over the last couple of weeks since President Donald Trump is back in the White House. See you soon. Welcome back to Brussels, My Love, our weekly politics show with me, Maeve McMahon, where we take a look back at the news of the week. And one story we wanted to zoom in brings us to Nuuk in Greenland, where the local parliament got back to work this week after their winter break. It was their first meeting since President Trump was sworn in, saying he wanted to buy or take the island of 56,000 people. President Trump says controlling Greenland is essential to US national and economic security. He also wants perhaps its national resources from rare earth minerals to iron. Now, Greenland is, of course, tied to Denmark politically and culturally, and Denmark has already warned the US Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, that Greenland is not for sale. So, Ian Lesser, we'll bring you in here first. What do you make of this debate on Greenland?
Well, it's odd at many levels, but one of them, of course, is that the United States already dominates the security of Greenland. We have a substantial base there. It could easily be expanded. We have economic activity there. It could easily be expanded. It's not really about Greenland. It's about China. It's about Russia. And it's about a certain mythology about opening up the high north and all sorts of other things. But very, 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 very odd turn in American policy.
What about the Parliament? How have you been reacting there?
We have been reacting for sure, and that's also a concern. I think that we spend the last few weeks more time reacting to Trump's shenanigans, which we have to take very seriously, by the way. I will come back to that in a minute, but than solving our own problems. But this, of course, is a European problem because for the time being, Greenland will be part of the Danish domain and it's NATO territory. And it is extremely concerning that Trump is out to completely undermine the international order and NATO order. And that should be top priority for all.
Hugely important.
Peter, your view?
But he always has 2 points, and he digged into that is one of this troubled relations between Greenland and Denmark. We have seen this problem. It was too long called as a domestic issue. It is not giving the strategic importance. We should have taken, Denmark itself had taken more advance. And the second is indeed what you referred, and that's Arctic strategy. We are just now about to develop, ignored for too long, but it's an essential issue. That's absolutely correct.
And also, and I agree with you, we have to develop an own European Arctic strategy that's becoming more and more urgent on security, but also obviously on economic interest and geostrategic interest. But I also think that it's really important that we understand, and that's something that we heard from colleagues from my parliamentary fraction, that they have been on a mission to Greenland in last week. We also have to understand that the people of Greenland they don't particularly want to be Danish. They don't want to be Americans.
Well, on that point, actually, it's interesting because everyone's talking about Greenland, even though most people probably don't even know exactly where it is. And Shona Murray accompanied your colleagues on that trip, Euronews' reporter, and actually had the opportunity to speak to some locals, and we can play an excerpt from them there.
You're talking about independence, but what does independence mean? No one is truly independent. We are all relying on everyone else. No one really wants to be bought by the US. I mean, the whole abrupt way of coming forward and saying that I want to buy Greenland, it's like we're not for sale. We're not playing Monopoly here in this world.
It's very colonial mindset when you think when Denmark no longer has Greenland, US will just take it. And it's just like colonizers talking with another colonizer mindset. It's like we have rights as human beings.
It's a very clear message from locals there that it's not for sale. And data shows that 85% of locals are against joining the US. In fact, they want to push for self-governance.
If you want to be serious about an Arctic strategy, whether it's for the United States or for Europe or for NATO, buy more icebreakers. Figure out ways for people to invest there in responsible ways. I think Mark Rutte, the Secretary General of NATO, his approach is actually quite the right one on this. We just say, okay, you're concerned about security in Greenland. NATO can take a bigger role there, and it will be fully in line with transatlantic security interests, and it's not going to send strange signals to allies and all the rest of it. That's the way forward.
Yeah, Mark Rutte, Secretary General of NATO, he joined EU leaders this week for their retreat here in Brussels where they were discussing defence, and he made that point. Is that the right strategy?
Yes, and what it also says is that we need to wake up as Europe and be able to solve our own defense and security on our own. As part of NATO, yes, because we believe in NATO as the alliance which keeps us safe. But yet, we have someone in the White House who's not very reliable. So this is the time to invest in our own defense, production and operations and see if we as Europe once and for all wake up from this peace dividend on which we have been living for decades.
And that was precisely the message that was coming out of that retreat this Monday.
Well, and we have to be able to say no, even to our closest ally. And we have seen how Canada and Mexico reacted in different ways, sometimes very clever. I must say, I think we can learn a lot also from these kind of confrontations.
And just on that summit, were you following it on Monday with the EU leaders? Did you think it was a success, this idea to have this retreat more reflective?
Well, you have to have this reflection. I mean, and, in a certain sense, the advent of another Trump administration is really, just put more fuel under issues that were already very hot in Europe for real reasons. I mean, economic competitiveness is one, but also strategic autonomy, the defense industrial base, all those things. Another, those are really tough issues. It would be better to do them with a transatlantic relationship that works and without this style. Because, in fact, it's a huge, who knows what, decades-long project to build European defense in a way that would somehow compensate for the loss of the United States. And that, by the way, that could happen by something happening in Asia. It doesn't have to be Donald Trump being disenchanted. It could be other things. Very tough to do, but important to have the debate.
And when will President Trump be paying a visit to Brussels?
Well, I hope very soon. But he is ambitious in other issues and doesn't put it on the highest agenda, unfortunately.
Ian might have some insights.
No, I don't have any indication, but I mean, I also have a vision in my mind, perhaps, of President von der Leyen going to Mar-a-Lago or something like this that would maybe serve the same purpose. I'm not sure how it would end, but
because of course we saw a couple of weeks ago Giorgia Meloni visited Mar-a-Lago,
successfully,
and she had a phone call with President von der Leyen, who was sick in bed that date, so she could pass on her messages. But indeed,
which is problematic on several levels, because we also see, and we might discuss that also later today, but we also see that Giorgia Meloni is proactively undermining European initiatives to become more self-sufficient on the field of defense, on the field of space, for example. So I do think that it's problematic when one single EU leader, who also has on some aspects a very much anti-European agenda, takes the lead in the transatlantic relationships. I would prefer to see that coordinated from the Commission and the Council.
Well, on that very interesting point, we can bring this conversation to an end. Thank you so much to our panel for being with us. And thank you so much for watching. Of course, for any more information on anything you've heard, check out euronews.com. But for now, see you soon here on Euronews. Hello there and welcome to Brussels, my love, your News' weekly politics chat show. I'm Maeve McMahon and along with Peter Heffele, Policy Director at the Wilfred Martin Centre, Raquel García Hermida van der Valle, Liberal MEP from the Netherlands, and Ian Lesser, Director of the Brussels branch of the American think tank, the German Marshall Fund. We're just taking a look back at the news of the week. And one that turned our heads was this. The EU's first ever Commissioner for Space speaking at the annual European Space Conference, calling for a European Space Shield. Andrius Kubilius from Lithuania will also be in charge of defence. And he's calling for a big bang approach to space with huge European investments. With more and more countries competing for dominance in space and Russia and China even joining forces, the Commissioner has warned that Europeans cannot leave space to, quote, aggressive authoritarians. Peter, your take on this. How realistic are these plans to invest?
Of the conference you referred to, indeed, was not only Kubilius attending, it was also Virkkunen and Kallas that shows how much importance it's put beyond the defense issue. This is an issue across also technology. And what we often forget, I think Europeans are leading in space technology in many ways. We just look to Elon Musk's launching pads, but this is only a tiny part of the story. But nobody talks about Galileo or Iris. This is very technical issues, so we don't get the message out.
Well, the director, of course, of the European Space Agency was there at that conference, and he's actually very confident. And we had a chat with him. We can take a listen to Joseph Aschbacher.
People think Europe is not strong in space. We're actually very strong. We have a few programs where we are among the best in the world, where we are the senior partner, and sometimes NASA is the junior partner in some of our programs. We need three things to succeed. Number one, we need talent. And number two, you need money, access to money. And number three, we need to be simpler, faster and more agile.
So there you go, the director of the European Space Agency, Raquel. Now we're spending around 12 billion in space. Is that enough?
I think that it's a matter of coordinating better, but definitely spending more and investing more in our own autonomy, what Ian said. I'm not so much for putting a number on it at this point, but I do think that it's important what the Commissioner said, that we're not reliant and dependent on aggressive autocrats. And let me be very clear about that. I consider Elon Musk, with his dominance of commercial satellites, part of that constellation of aggressive autocrats. And we have seen the consequences for that in the war in Ukraine, where at some point he was apparently had a change of heart and decided that he might not offer access to the Ukrainian forces to Starlink satellites anymore.
You mentioned Elon Musk's big plans, and of course President Trump, when he was sworn in, he mentioned Mars and his big plans to pursue his destiny into the stars, launching American astronauts to plant the stars and stripes on the planet Mars. How did that go down?
I think there's every reason for Europe to want to do more in this space, to use the term. I think, look, it's partly about commercial interest. It's partly about defense interest, which is growing, obviously. But it's also, in a sense, about prestige. For the European project, national prestige. Certainly when President Trump has spoken about it, there is a heavy dose of that, and that's very historic for the United States, going back to the Kennedy administration and even earlier. But the point is very well taken that Europe is already a leader in many respects on space. The question is, how much money? Money was mentioned as one of the key three things. How much money compared to what is now going to be needed in other parts of the portfolio that was mentioned on defense, for example?
It's always down to money, and money is tight. We also wanted to hear, Peter, from a European astronaut to get his take. So we had a chat with the Italian Luca Parmitano. Take a listen.
There is a lot to look forward to for European astronauts. Right now, for the short term, we have 2 astronauts already in training for their mission to the International Space Station. We are looking forward to Artemis 2 mission, the first mission with a crew to the moon, around the moon, I should say. Because that will be the opening statement that will allow European astronauts to start thinking about flying towards the moon, first to the gateway, and then one day also in the long term on the surface of the moon. Let's not forget that the Lunar Gateway, the space station that we're building around the moon, is built almost entirely here in Europe. So I would say that we have some unique expertise.
So Luca Parmitano there, being very positive, like you were, Peter, there earlier.
Yes, and following what you said, and in defense issues, this is one of the biggest holes in our spectrum of capabilities. We cannot talk about autonomy if we do not fill that gap, and we have seen the weaknesses so far. Yeah. And it's logic, and it's the same like the Arctic. These are the 2 points where we had not extended our outreach.
It's like we're late to the conversation, no?
I'm not sure that we're late to the conversation. I feel very encouraged by what we hear from the European Space Agency on how we are leading on many fronts. And again, to make my point about being reliant on our own prowess, I think that it's important that member states keep investing in European capabilities. And I think it sends the absolute wrong signal when countries like Italy, under Meloni, is going to be making one-on-one deals with Elon Musk instead of investing in what we are already doing as Europe.
Part of this is about economic competitiveness as well, but part of it is also about defense needs and other things. It would be so much easier and so much more efficient, that was mentioned, if we didn't have this problem of trust across the Atlantic. I mean, increasingly you could imagine this European debate about space policy being driven more and more about perceptions of American unreliability. Somehow. That's not the place we should be if we're all looking for efficiency and reliability.
But was it a priority in the previous administration?
For Biden? Sure. I mean, there have always been commercial, part of this is about, there's a big commercial piece to this, but there's also a big defense piece, a big intelligence piece. It's hugely important for all sorts of reasons. There, I think the relationship across the Atlantic via NATO was much more predictable.
And just finally, describe to our viewers how this European Space Shield could look.
Well, major components are already there, and the plans are extremely ambitious. As I mentioned, we talk too often about Musk, but if you look into the ambitions of Europe, it's impressive how we fill these gaps and how advanced the technology is. And we are not the only one. Well, Japan, for example, is an interesting partner, or India. So it's not just the United States who's matter in this equation.
One of the big tests for this will actually be competing ideas about missile defense. In the United States, in Europe, where we have now competing ideas of how to organize this. It's hugely expensive. It's maybe hugely important. A lot of it is about space policy.
And you mentioned India. There's plans for the European Commission President and I believe her whole team to head there very soon. She was speaking this week to European ambassadors from all across the globe. But on that point, we can bring this conversation to an end. Thank you so much to Raquel García Armida van der Valle, Liberal MEP from the Netherlands, for being with us, Peter Heffele, Director of the Wilfred Martin Centre, and Ian Lesser, the Director of the German Marshall Fund here in Brussels. Thank you so much for being with us. And thank you, of course, for watching. BrusselsMyLove@Euronews.com. That is our email address if you want to drop us a line on anything you've heard today or any topics that you'd like us to dive into. And also you can check out Euronews.com for any more in-depth analysis. Thanks again for watching. See you soon.